Okay, thank you very much. Let's get started. I'm Jonathan Parker. I'm chairing the session. I'm one of the co-directors of the Golub Center. This session, so after that last session on government support of lending markets in a variety of different ways and government guarantee of lending, government bailouts for banks, we're now going to talk about one of the great credit booms of the last decade, and we'll talk about China's credit policies, and we'll just go through in order in the paper. So the first speaker is Jennie Bai.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks. The slides is not changing.
Yeah, you just click through.
I see. Well, thank you for having us. We're going to talk about the Great Wall of Debt. Okay. So the main topic is mainly about China's local government debt. Hopefully it can bring you some fresh ideas of what's happening in China and China's credit market. It's joint work with Andrew Yang and Haoyu. So any of you who have been to China probably enjoy the high-speed trains in China. So from the mega project of the Shanghai Tower to everything, bridges, roads, public transportation, water supply, and more, the real estate market, everything of them probably you don't know is most of them is financed by the Cheng-Tai bonds. These bonds, you might never heard about it. All these duties usually is done through the municipal bond in the United States. But in China, up to the time we are writing the paper, there is no such thing called a municipal bond, at least no genuine municipal bond. Instead, the Chinese, all these things is through something similar, but it has fundamental different features. It's called a Cheng-Tai bond. Literally, it's urban construction and investment bonds. So Cheng-Tai bond market has grown dramatically. In 1992, it's the first one in Shanghai, about 500 million. But by the end of 2016, the total outstanding is $7.28 trillion renminbis. If you're thinking about the U.S. municipal market, when they're growing from zero to today's $3.4 trillion, that's taking more than a half century to achieve that status. But in China, it's less than 10 years achieving everything. The large size, fast growth, and the central role in China's infrastructure development make the Cheng-Tai bond itself interesting to study. However, we want to argue that this market has some distinctive features which make it uniquely suitable to study the impact of the government guarantee, and which is different from the first session. That's all clear, explicit guarantee, but this one is implicit. So we need to use market to derive what is are they, and useful to study what is impact of political risk. Now let's looking at some of the key features by doing a comparison with U.S. munis. So fundamentally, muni is municipal bond, enjoy all the great features of municipal bond, but Cheng-Tai bond, CTB, is corporate bond. So second, in the USA, the central government bears no responsibility if Massachusetts has any of this default of their bond. But in China, I will introduce very soon. Due to the local government financing features, central government bears implicit guarantee. But because of implicit, no one can tell exactly to what extent. Is that a real guarantee? Would you really do it? To what degree? People got no idea about it. In the US, it's you and I, such individuals, holding a lot of the municipal bond. But in China, majority of that is holding by the shadow banking system. This is also making the China's Cheng-Tai bond will affect the financial stability in China. So one more important feature about Cheng-Tai bond is this one is often used some collateral. And what is that collateral? It's land use right, which naturally links this market to the China's real estate market. So as I said, this paper, we interest to study what is market distortion. In particular, we want to focus on three dimensions: central government guarantee, what is province risk exposure, and also in terms of detailed implementation, what is how the local government solvency. I will tell you about what is local government financing is about, and the local government political risk. This is three dimensions of main result we find most important to the Cheng-Tai bond pricing, at least from the perspective of the market investor. So let's go back to this example. Shanghai Tower, $2.4 billion, the second largest building in the world at current moment. This one was issued by Shanghai Cheng-Tai Corporation. And that is founded in 1992 by Shanghai municipal government. As you can tell, this is things already linked directly to the government. This company doing very well. They have 27 subsidiaries covering almost every infrastructure in Shanghai. And they have relatively very good net income and the profitability. Another sharp example to this is this one. This is a bond issued by the Ordos City Construction Investment Group. If anyone knows this Ordos, which is a coal mining city in the inner Mongolia, and this company's main business is land sales and land development in this city. According to tons of the media in the recent few years, they call the Ordos in China a modern ghost town. So although they build a lot of this real estate project, try to house, entertain, and host over 1 million people, but very often the entire town just empty as if a ghost town. This is a very typical example of the oversupply problem in the real estate market. So these two things make you to think about what is the role the local government plays. And then I need to give you some background. How local government finance themselves. So due to the 1994, the tax and the budget law in China, the local government, they don't have independent power. Their main revenue and deficit is coming from central government transfer. Everything, if you have revenue, return it to the government. If you have deficit, don't worry, the central government give it to you, especially Tibet, Ningxia, those provinces, they got a lot of central government, these transfers. However, this is a typical thing. And in the recent 1 decade, 2 decades, they also start a major business revenue is about land sales. So for land sales, they really don't have all lands in China, no private. But each province, they have land use right. They can sell it for the land development. That's their main things. Everything started to change or accelerated since the global financial crisis in 2008. As some of you may know, China has its own QE in 2008, 2009. That is 4 trillion renminbi. And 2.8 of them, central government said, you guys, local government, you need to shoulder yourself. They don't give you money, but you need to find a way to find out the money. The point is, they cannot levy any additional tax. Doesn't matter the sales, property, income tax. They don't have that power. Another more important thing, local government, they cannot borrow directly from banks, or they neither cannot issue the government, the municipal bond. So, and another last straw for this one is in China, the local official promotion crucially depends on how you develop your city, how you make your growth and revenue things. And all of this giving a tremendous pressure, which is go beyond the normal balance. And to figure out this problem, the local government figure out a smart way. They call it local government financing vehicle. Sounds familiar from all those SPV, all the things. In the United States crisis, it's exactly the case. This local government financing vehicle, they are corporations. But as you can tell, they have more or less relationship with the local government. So they can issue bonds, and they can also borrow loans. The loans gonna be the second paper I'm gonna talk about. This one is mainly about the bonds. So what role does local government play in the Chengdu bond pricing? And do they really play such roles? First, I want to give you one example. So in the Chengdu bond market, so far there is no real default, but there is one pseudo default in the Yunnan province, which is bordered from Tibet. Yunnan Highway Development Investment, they made one-sided announcement in 2011 saying that they will only pay interest, but not the principal of it. After they made this announcement, the market got panic, and the Yunnan provincial government immediately stepped in. They asked the firm to withdraw the claim, and then they coordinated such payment. So they talked to the banks, talked to the local borrowers, lenders, so they immediately fixed this problem. So it's a pseudo default, but it never really happened, and the government immediately stepped in. Other examples of government intervention is the National Development and Reform Commission, 国家发改委. They subsequently, after this event, relaxed the approval process for Chengdu bond issuance. And due to that, the Chengdu bond issuance doubled immediately in 2012, then the 2011. And more, the Ministry of Finance and DRC, they will encourage a swap from the very riskier, high-cost local government financing vehicle debt to the low-yield true municipal bond. So all of this point out local government play roles, and then we want to do the test. Our main findings probably is three-dimensional. First, we show that given each of these Cheng-Tai bonds fundamentally have the central government implicit guarantee. In that case, they should more or less show some homogeneity in the Cheng-Tai bond yield. But indeed, there are still a large heterogeneity in the Cheng-Tai bond yields. And then we want to explain what are those heterogeneity, how the market investors perceive those things. So if you're familiar with fixed income market, you have all these conventional risk factor, credit risk, liquidity risk, issuers, solvency, all this problem. What we find is all of this has something different thing from the traditional corporate bond pricing. For example, credit risk matters, but in a far less degree compared to similar corporate bonds. And the liquidity even play opposite roles. Usually bonds with more illiquidity have a higher yield. But in here, it's opposite. It's actually exactly showing that investors perceive there is such implicit guarantee, and then they're reaching for the yield. Those treated mostly are those with higher yield. And finally, if you control for these issuer dummies, all the issuers' solvency no longer matters. So each of them is different from the traditional corporate bond pricing or the fixed income pricing. And then we want to ask the question, what really matters for this Cheng-Tai bond? So what we mainly find is two main things. First, the provincial level real estate market performance measured by the real estate value-added GDP. They are probably the most important driving factor. One standard deviation increase in local real estate GDP, that will contribute to 8.6% decrease in the Cheng-Tai bond yields, which means the reduction of the cost of capital. So they are supporting that the real estate is really the growth engine in the local financing. Secondly, using a novel measure, we talked about the anti-corruption campaign in China, which is the third paper. You're going to hear more details. We show that such a political risk also significantly elevate the Cheng-Tai bond yields. What is probably more interesting is these two has interactions. If you conditional on the high political risk, real estate will actually increase the cost of capital for the local government, and suggesting that investors perceive has to be a relatively healthy environment, real estate play a role. If in a not healthy, like in the orders, there is an oversupply environment, real estate actually damaging the local financing cost. That's our main result. Now, let me go through a more details. So I probably skip the detail of data, but I only one thing to mention. So Cheng-Tai bond is only one part of the local government financing. However, this is the only asset in the market. You have a transaction data in the secondary market. So the second paper will tell you about local government financing vehicles loans. But here, this is the only thing you can see how traders do it day by day to get a sense of how the market perceives the risk, how the market perceives the implicit guarantee. So, thanks. So we study object is the Cheng-Tai bond excess yield following the fixed income convention. We using the Cheng-Tai bond yield minus the central government bond implied cash flow measured yield to measure this excess risk. And then the first thing I want to show you whether given the central government guarantee, we can still how the Cheng-Tai bond yield performs across different provinces. Here I'm showing you the dispersion about this Cheng-Tai bond yield with median and 10-90 percentile. As you can tell, this after reducing the national government yield, this excess yield still varies significantly. And usually it becomes wider when the median level is larger. It's worth noting is from here, the later of 2013, there's downward trend about it. So one more thing about this Cheng-Tai bond. This will be a legacy asset. It's only existing in China, and will step by step withdraw from the historical stage. China, from 2017, is already started officially issue municipal bond, try to reduce their cost of capital. So this provides legacy asset, provide only chance. You can see what is market perceived, the local risk. So if you sorting the different provinces, 30 provinces, by the way, almost every province in the city level, county level, as long as they can issue Chengtou bond, they try their best to take advantage of this. If you sorting by the 30 provinces issued by geography, fiscal deficit, GDP growth, or the local real estate price, you can see this quite large dispersion in those things. Overall, this is 200 basis point excess cost of yield. So this descriptive thing show you Chengtou bond yields still exist, significant economic heterogeneity across all the provinces. And then we want to test what are those important things. First, I show you some of the conventional risk factors. In an unreported table, we also do this for the state-owned enterprises, but that is a genuine corporate bond in China. There, as contrast, that rating has much larger magnitude, which means the credit risk only play a much smaller role in the Chengtou bond market, and the liquidity is opposite role, as you can tell. So most liquid Chengtou bond are those with higher yield. It's reflecting investors are chasing, reaching for the yield things. We also have another unreported table show if you're adding the issuer solvency, like issuer leverage, profitability, all those things, once you control for the dummy of the issuer, none of them works, okay? So this is all kind of different from what my other research, the conventional risk factor, how it works for the bond. And then we want to move on to this implicit government guarantee. We first construct provincial risk exposure in the asset pricing way to the central government. We use that as control variable. And then more detail, I want to focus on this local government solvency performance and local government political risk. First, I'd like to give you a bunch of facts. This is by the Ministry of Finance about the revenue source for local government. The most majority is almost 30% is by the central government transfer. And the next one is tax. And this part is land sales for the land use right and other fees. If you're looking at this tax part, thanks, majority of them, 40%, is real estate related. So overall, you can tell local government heavily rely on the real estate things. And this is more showing that their reliance on real estate leads to a lot of this local government's revenue volatility things. So this is all supporting things. We're going to testing these two things. Whether real estate in the local government helps to boosting the economy or is oversupply damaging the economy and hence increase the cost of financing. So our main result is we show you different combination of the GDPs. In particular, you can see after including everything of them, this real estate value-added GDP is dominating about it. If you're looking at more component of this one, you can looking at the real estate tax, land cost, price, loan, and investment. All of them more or less speak the role, okay, because they are naturally positively correlated. But to do the thing, we're using the real estate GDP to do the synchronize everything of them. So that is one thing. The last thing is about political risk. So in China, real estate market is a natural hotbed for the corruption things. So we construct this unique data from the anti-corruption campaign in China, which is the third paper going to tell you more detail. Pretty much in every province, we're collecting who are the investigated by the central government disciplinary intermediary. And we also collecting their rankings manually, and we can construct the weighted average index and the number of officials investigated. If you run this regression, you can tell that the corruption distract the values and hence increase the financing cost. And mostly when we introducing these interactions, you can tell real estate still plays its role to reduce the cost of capital. But once you add the interaction of them, it's actually showing that only in a really healthy environment, real estate is actually boosting local economy. So This is a paper. We're talking about China's one important source of local government financing. And we hope you to take away is local government implementation on the real estate market and on the political risk really play a role. And that's how the market investors perceive the risk embedded in such implicit guarantee. Thank you very much.
Our second paper is by Hong Ru.
So first of all, thank you very much for including our paper in the program. So this is a joint work with Haoyu from Central University of Finance and Economics and Tang from the University of Hong Kong. So the first paper in this program is about the bond market for the local government debt, and this paper is about the bank loans in the local government debt market. And by using a unique loan level data, we are looking at the default patterns and issuance patterns of the local government debt. So why this is an important question? So first of all, China is the second largest economy across the globe. However, if you read the newspapers about China nowadays, everybody is talking about the risks in China's financial systems or in this political systems. And as a matter of fact, the Moody and S&P just downgraded China for the first time since 1989. And among all these risks, the local government debt is definitely on top of the list. So for example, specifically in 2014, the total amount of the local government debt reached to 24 trillion RMB, which is around 37% of the GDP in China. And not only in China, the government debt becomes a serious issue in many other countries. So just to give you an example, the credit from the development financial institutions, normally development banks, has been growing rapidly during the recent time period. And there is a looming concerns on the default risks of this government debt. So it is very important to understand these patterns of the debt issuance and the default. However, this is a very, very challenging task in China. So the reason being, most of these local government debt in China are off the balance sheet. So I will get into the institution details later on. So because all these debt are off the balance sheet, it is very difficult to estimate even the total amount of the local government debt in China. So in sum, it is a very important and critical topic, very timely topic. However, we still have a very limited knowledge of it. So this is what we are going to fill in for this paper. So we are using a unique loan level data to identify this off-the-balance sheet debt in China for these local governments. So we are able to trace each loan to document a lot of interesting stylized effects across regions and over time. So among all these facts we find, the most interesting one is that the development bank loans perform much better than commercial bank loans in China. So in particular, we find that the China Development Bank, the CDB loans, have significantly lower delinquency ratio than the commercial banks. So this is actually quite surprising and against the conventional wisdom, because in the literature, people always argue that these policy loans should have a higher default ratio. First, they have softer budget constraint. Second of all, they usually invested in the negative NPV project with positive externalities. So in other words, these policy loans, they're entitled or they're supposed to have the higher default ratio than the commercial bank loans. However, we find the exact opposite in China. And not only in China, this is also a very prevalent phenomenon in many other countries. So for example, in Japan, in Brazil, and in India, the development banks also perform much, much better than commercial banks. So the question is why and how they can do that. So in this paper, we document a new channel which is called the selective default strategy. So specifically, we find that the distressed local government, they will choose to default on the commercial bank loans first. So they're reluctant to default on the loans from the China development banks. And by the way, this selective default is totally legal in China. So the question is why the local government wanted to default on commercial bank loans first and pay off the CDB first. So we have two hypotheses, and we find two factors in our empirical analysis. So first is the relationships between the China Development Bank and the local government. And this relationship can help this local government to raise money from the China Development Bank, and which in turn will help these local politicians' career advancement. Okay? So let me be more specific. So the CDB is the most important financial sources for this local government, which provide around 50% of the total bank credit. So CDB is very important for the local government. And this local government, they need to raise money from the China Development Bank and invest in the local economy to boost up the local GDP, which in turn also very important for these politicians' promotions. And so in China, we don't have elections for these politicians. They're assigned by the higher level of the government, the Communist Party. So the local economic performance is the most important determinant of their promotion. So that's why the local politicians cares about the relationship with this China Development Bank, and they don't want to default on them, because if they do so, the China Development Bank will cut them off for the future financing. All right? And furthermore, we use this 4 trillion stimulus package in 2008 as the exogenous shock to the relationship between the CDB and the local government. And we find that when CDB becomes exogenously become more important, we find more selective defaults. So that's our identification strategy. Okay. So before I show you some all these regressions and identification, the different identification, let me give you some big pictures of this market. So this is the amount of the local government debt in China from 2002 to 2014. So as you can see, it's increasing dramatically over this 12 years or 13 years, from 1.5 trillion in 2002 to 24 trillions in 2014, which is around 37% of the GDP. So if you think about this number, it might not be too high compared with the US or the other countries, but the growth pattern is dramatic. Okay? And it keeps growing, actually. So that's why people start to worry about the risks or the default risks in this market. And this is the role of the development banks in China. So that's the total assets of the China Development Bank divided by the GDP. So you can see that the China Development Bank in China plays a very more and more important role in the economy. And this is not only about the China, but also in the other countries. So the dotted line is for the other countries. So as you can see, the development banks play a more and more important role across the globe. But on the other side, the commercial banks, their NPL ratio is about 5%. It's increasing over time. That's the solid line. But on the other side, the development banks, the DFIs, their default ratio, NPL is about 2%, and it's decreasing over time. So as I said before, this is very striking empirical evidence, because so in this paper, we're going to figure out what's the reason behind this pattern, and in the context of China. Okay? So since Jennie did a good job to introduce the background of the local government debt in China, I'm going to be very brief on this. So basically, the local government in China, they only share 30% of the tax revenue. The other 70% goes to the central government. And on the other side, they cannot borrow directly. So it's prohibited by this 1994 budget law. So you can see that these local government in China, they have a very limited tax revenue, and they're credit constrained. But they need to invest in the local economy and boost up the GDP. So there's a huge gap between the local government investment and financing. So how to solve that? The answer is the off-balance sheet loans. So these local government, they actually CDB helped this local government to set up these so-called local government financing vehicles, and these vehicles can borrow for this local government. So all these loans are off the balance sheet. So there are 3 major financing sources of this local government. So first of all, it's a bank loan. That's what this paper about. The second is the bond for the first paper, and they can also borrow from the shadow banking system. So the data we have here is the loan level data from the credit registry. It's the China Banking Regulatory Commission, CBRC. So the data has 19 largest banks in China, 2 policy banks plus 17 commercial banks in China. And it covers around 80% of the total bank credit in China, and almost 100% of the local government loans in China. So the coverage of this data set is very good. And it also has a very comprehensive loan level information. So for example, the loan amount and the issuance bank and the identity of the firm, the borrowers, and the maturity of these loans, the third-party guarantee, the internal ratings, and the delinquency. But unfortunately, we don't have the interest rate. So other than interest rate information, we have basically all the other contract terms at the loan level. Okay? So the second data set we have is the list of local government financing vehicles It's the official list from the CBRC. So based on this list, we can tease out these local government financing vehicles from the normal corporations in China and identify these off-balance sheet loans for the local governments. Okay, so this is the first. Let me show you some summary statistics. So this is the first one. This is the loan composition across different banks. So the red line is for the China Development Bank. And they contribute around 50 to 60% of the total bank credit in this market. And compared with the other banks, other big 5 banks in China, the China Development Bank is the #1 bank to provide credit for the local governments. Okay, so that's one thing to remember. And in terms of the industry distribution, most of these loans goes to the infrastructure projects and also the real estate market. Okay, so infrastructure project, real estate market. And if you look at the regional distribution, that's the loan to GDP ratio. The darker the color, the higher the loan to GDP ratio. You can see that the province like Yunnan, Chongqing, and Hainan, they're highly indebted. But on the East Coast, for these rich provinces, they're fine because they have a higher GDP so they can borrow more, right? And we actually cross-check this data with some public available information, and these are very consistent at the aggregate level with the public available data. So now let me show you the first result of this paper, the unconditional default patterns. So for the local government financing vehicles debt, the commercial banks, the default ratio is 1.8%. But on the other side, the China Development Bank, the default rate is 0.3%. So as you can see, the China Development Bank loans perform much, much better than commercial bank loans in this market. However, for these non-local government financing vehicles, these normal corporate loans, these two types of the banks have a very, very close default ratio, 0.9%. Okay? So this suggests that something must be going on for these local government financing vehicles, and the local government might play an important role behind this better performance for the China Development Bank. And next, we run the regressions. And our main variable of interest is the default at the loan level. So we control for these the loan characteristics and the firm characteristics and bunch of fixed effect. So consistent with these unconditional patterns I just showed you guys, the China Development Bank loans has significantly lower default probabilities. And also and this is a very robust result. We control for many other things. And I want you to focus on the column 4. Here we control for the firm times year fixed effect. So basically the variation we explore is within the firm, within the same year, but across different banks. So this mitigates the concern that the China Development Bank, they might select into the better firms, and that could explain this better performance of the China Development Bank. So by controlling this firm times the year fixed effect, we actually control for a lot of demand shocks from this market. Okay, so as I said, this is a very robust result. And we also do the propensity score matching to try to compare the similar loans to the similar industry, to the similar firms. And the question is why China Development Bank can enjoy such a low default ratio, and how they do that. So the first one is the selected default strategy. So on the left-hand side, that's, again, the default probability at the loan level. So we selected the loan. So conditional on defaulting loans, we select all these loans borrowed from this local government with the same maturity time as these defaulted ones. Okay? So we find that the China Development Bank dummy, again, have a significantly lower default probabilities. So that means that when the government, they have to default on somebody, they will choose not to default on China Development Banks. So the next question is why? Why they don't want to default on China Development Banks? So the hypothesis we propose is the career concerns of these local politicians. So first of all, the China Development Banks, the loans can help the local GDP growth. And the local GDP growth is very important for the promotion of these local politicians. So that's why they don't want to piss off the #1 financing sources they have, the China Development Bank. All right? And furthermore, we wanted to use these 4 trillion programs as the exogenous shock to the financial dependence of this local government on the China Development Bank. So let me give you these pictures here. So the 4 trillion program was initiated in November 2008. So before November 2008, China Development Bank was the most important credit provider for these local governments. But after this 4 trillion program, a lot of the commercial banks, they enter into this market and they give the credit to these local governments. So as you can see, these blue bars from 2008, 2009, and 2010. So all of these banks start to increase their lendings to the local government. So China Development Bank doing these 4 trillion programs are not so special for these local governments because they can borrow from almost all these big 5 banks in China. But what's interesting is that after this 4 trillion program, so we have a sudden pullback of this 4 trillion program in June 2010. So after this sudden pullback, so these red bars, 2011 to 2012, so these big 5 banks start to withdraw from this market. So they stop lending to the local government. But CDB, the China Development Bank, keeps lending to they actually increase their outstanding loan amount to the local government. So you can see that after this 2010, CDB becomes even more important for these local governments. Okay, so that's something I want you to remember. So here is also the selected default, the regressions we did before, but then we interacted this CDB dummy with this 4 trillion package, which means that the loan expired during this 4 trillion program. Okay, so if that's the case, so first of all, the CDB still enjoy the priority to get the loan payment first. Okay, the coefficient is significantly negative, but doing this 4 trillion package, it's not, so it's a significantly positive here, the interaction terms, which means that during this 4 trillion stimulus pack, the time period, CDB was not so special. So this local government, they can borrow from the other commercial banks in China. So that's why we don't see a lot of selected default during this 4 trillion program. And after this 4 trillion program, because all these commercial banks, they kind of exit this market, and only CDB kept lending to this local government. So CDB becomes even more important, and we find this interaction terms is significantly negative. Okay, so that means this relation, the financial continuation, is the key for CDB to have very low default ratios in China. So okay, now let me wrap up here. So this paper is about the local government debt in China as contribute to this growing literature. And we find that the better performance for policy bank loans in China. This is actually very surprising and against the conventional wisdom. So we find the mechanism is the selected default, harder budget constraint for the development banks. And we find that actually we document a novel mechanism to harden budget constraints by disciplining these local governments via their career concerns. Okay, so this is all I have here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third paper will be presented by Zhou.
Okay, let me first thank Debbie and Jonathan and the Chang-Tai preemptively. So this paper is a joint work with Bo Li and Zhengwei Wang. Both are assistant professor at PBC School of Finance, my colleague. So they were struggling with the ideas. So one day we talked, I gave advice saying, why don't you look at most important and controversial issue in the largest economy? So that's a result of this paper, this China's anti-corruption campaign and the financing effect shifting between the SOE and non-SOE. So let's think of one political shock. Bo Xilai is arrested. So a firm run by Xu Ming, he's a white glove, is in the real estate. So to assess the economic impact, we want to look at how that affects all the competitors in the same real estate industries. The existing results is all over the place. So if you are the firm similarly run as Xu Ming's firm, you may get investigated. So it's a contagion hypothesis. But if you behave in the opposite way, so you may grab some market share. So that's why the results are all over the place. There's no clear dividing line. However, there is a decisive dividing line in China. That line is state-owned enterprises and private-owned enterprises. So what we find is state-owned enterprises, upon these events, announcements, reduced financing, but private-owned enterprises get more financing. If anyone familiar with literature on China or transitional economy, you know this is the opposite to the normal time. SOE always got almost all the financing. This is exactly the opposite result. Then we also look at different components of total financing. So loan versus bond, short-term debt versus long-term debt, extensive margin, intensive margin. They all point to the same direction, but tentatively leading to the role of the bankers, the credit supply story. Then we design a natural experiment as an investigation for one big financial industry CEOs as a natural experiment to see whether the supply effect is there. So it's tentatively yes. Then in the end, we also connect with other existing study. We are the first one doing the financing. There are people who look at the stock market price reactions, look at capital investment, and look at market share. So we also connect those. They are consistent. So in the end, we come to the conclusion, which is not that popular at the time, that the anti-corruption campaign actually is good for the economy. That's ran against 95% of the news media stories, at that time, at least. So I don't have too much time to go through the literature, maybe even the data design. Just let me briefly say, we look at all the 78 cases of a senior leader investigation, like Hsieh, they are minister level. We pick only 31 of them, which represent a first shock to an industry. We remove those repeated shocks to the industry for methodological reason. Then we look at all the listed firm, SOE and non-SOE. So this is a sort of basic strategy. I will skip most of the data, but I will say just one thing. You won't see it, it's too small. So the SOE is less efficient. The return to asset is much lower than private enterprise. Just let me emphasize that point. So the methodology, again, you cannot see it, but just let me tell you. It's a triple difference in difference approach. So the industry, the real estate industry is affected industry, the investigated industry. Then all other industry represent a control group. That within this affected industry versus non-affected industry, after the investigation, before the investigation, this is a different standard everybody knows. Then another layer is among the affected industry, you also look at SOE versus non-SOE. This is a triple. You can reverse the order anyway, but it's methodologically it's equivalent. So what do you see? Total debt, private enterprise increases. Bank loan increases, but not bond issues. Extensive margin, new loan probability, significant increase for private firm, but not necessarily intensive margin, the existing loan amount. And the short-term debt, significantly increasing for the non-SOE. So these are the basic sum of the result. So let me just point you to this picture. This is total debt, not in calendar time, but in event time. This zero is the announcement of investigating Hsieh. And the difference from almost the same becomes significantly diverged 3 quarters after the announcement. So this is the total debt. If you look at the bank loan, it's even more striking of the difference. So I will give you a number of economic magnitude. You won't see the number, but I will tell you. In the most stringent regression, control everything, the non-SOE get 45% increase of debt relative to other industry average. For SOE, it's very small decrease, like 10 to 20%. So at the first time we present the paper, people ask me, that's impossible, large numbers. We are also curious. But if you dig deep into the data, non-SOEs, many don't have loan at all. It's called credit, financial repression in the transitional economy. So 15% of the non-SOE get 50 million loan the first time after the anti-corruption investigation. So there's a reason why the loan amount is very big. But the total debt is not that big. It's only 20%. The loan, the bankers, perhaps plays a significant role of that. So again, I didn't emphasize here, the corporate bond both decrease but insignificant. But the loan increase for the private enterprise. So you think of that, loan is a lower financing cost, bond is a higher financing cost. For private firm, you actually substitute this high cost with a low cost loan. But that's not happening for the SOEs. That's one way to slice it. Another way to slice it, you won't see the number, just tell you, for the non-SOE, the new loan probability regression, increased significantly, about 10%. Then you're adding this different diff coefficient for SOE decreasing about 10%. So this extensive margin is more significant. But for the continuing getting loan, and the amount change between non-SOE, SOE is not that significant. It's a positive for non-SOE, negative to SOE, but the difference is not that big. For new loan, probability is very significant. And if you look at short-term debt, SOE significantly dominate SOE, but for long-term debt, it doesn't. Perhaps short-term debt is more under the discretion of bankers. Long-term loan maybe, long-term growth prospect, government policy. So it's not necessarily adjustable in a very short time. So these are the additional evidence. The three ways to slice this total debt, tentatively pointing to a role of bankers' role. So among all the 78 or 31 cases, there's only one big financial firm. So that's the white glove for the Ling Jihua, another sort of a top vice president being investigated. So this guy is running this Minsheng Bank. It's special of Minsheng Bank is it's lending both to the SOE and many to the non-SOE. So we use that as a natural experiment, a shock, and interact with standard different diff and the different diff coefficient. So you could find that after the Mao Xiaofeng, the Minsheng Bank CEO is rounded up, there's additional more shifting of credit to non-SOE to SOE, SOE to non-SOE. So this is January 30th, 2015. So it could pick up some trend. So let's do a falsification test. Move 1 year ahead and 2 years ahead. It shows no such thing. There's no additional shifting of credit if you're doing that. So that's a placebo test. Now let's connect our study of this credit financing to the typical stock price. People have done that. So if you look at these 31 cases, you'll find that the stock price also diverge between private firm and SOE firm. That's contrary to the other two papers just doing one event study. The Laura Liu's paper on Bo-Chi Lai and Lin Chen's paper on 8-point regulation. That's one event. You actually find it's insignificant or even opposite. But if you aggregate on the 78 or 31 event, you find that market expect private firm actually dominate. So that's abnormal return. And the other side of same coin is seasonal offering. That's a registered, you can offer any time, is increasing for the non-SOE firm, significant. In addition to equity market, we also look at the capital structure in response to the Tobin's Q, so investment. Here the result is much weaker. So you only have sign right, but the significance is not. But it's still not against our story, because non-SOE have higher return to assets. So even the higher Tobin's Q, so even this not significant, as long as they are sign right, you have more credit to non-SOE. The net total effect is still positive to the SOE. So although this regression is not highly significant, the effect is still there. Not only the investment efficiency, the market share for the sales also increased for the non-SOE, not significant, but decrease for the SOE is significant, if you look at the numbers in the table. So these are the most results we have done. We also look at robustness checks, not only the first event, but also first 5 events to the same industry. It doesn't work. You need to look at the first event. That's a natural experiment or uncertainty shock. So we also look at the total debt difference. That's a similar like a loan, like a flow variable. It's the same. So, for the falsification test of banking shock, we look at different years. Move 1 year ahead, 2 years ahead, 6 months ahead. They reach the same result. So these are the sort of thing. Let me conclude. I'm ahead of time. Okay. So I usually don't use it all the time, typically. So we find that China's anti-corruption campaign associated with relocation of credit from less productive SOE to more productive SOE peers. And by looking different components of the financing and looking at the natural experiment, it supports the story that credit supply is actually the channel. Let me argue why the credit demand may not be the channel. So it never be the case, even the SOE is investigated, it still enjoys government guarantee, implicit and explicit. There's no incentive for the SOE to reduce the demand. So the demand story just conceptually wouldn't work in a transitional or socialist economy. So lastly, that's the most controversial point, that this anti-corruption campaign benefits the economy because the credit is more efficiently relocated. At that time, most newspapers, and including the research paper, are arguing the otherwise, because the anti-corruption starting 2012 happened the same time as Chinese growth rate dropping from 10% to 6%. So you can see, people have, tangled this thing together. So we argue this macro level study haven't been able to rule out alternative hypotheses like global trade shrinking, global growth slowing down, or even China's structural change. That's the first point we want to argue against the popular view. The other one is, their paper look at the affected investigated firm. They are pretty bad. So they are arguing, this anti-corruption investigation will reduce people's motivation to work. Local governments, don't work as well as the local business don't work diligently. But we argue you could not only look at the affected firm. You want to look at all the competitors in the industry. From that point of view, it is possible that the firms who gain from this investigation outweigh those firms' loss. A third point, actually, in the middle is they overlook the bankers' role. The banks in China are not only state-owned banks, they also want to make a profit because they are listed firms. So, of course, they will support SOE as a government policy because there's guarantees there. So it's a safe, but a low return. While I also want to pay high salary, so I need to put some money to the risky private business. They may default, but they have high profit. It's always a balancing effect. So now suppose the SOE is investigated. One SOE is investigated. I may fear other SOE are also investigated. So at least on the margin, at least temporarily, I want to diversify risk. So that's very convincing, talking to the bankers, actually. That's true. So I'm almost done. So lastly, all the three papers, when I design a PhD courses on Chinese financial research topics, are in my course list. So I'm happy to see all three papers are including this conference. So they touch about 5 to 6 hot issues like anti-corruption, local government, shadow banking, and real estate. They have other hot button issues like irrational investment in China, stock trading, leverage and the stock market crash in 2015, split share reform, even pollution and investment decisions. They are generating a lot of interesting papers, and I'm designing these courses for PhD students. One downside is not many PhD students would enroll in the class, these elective courses. But the first and the second lecture is packed, fully packed. So I'm hoping when I reach the 12th and the 13th, the last lecture, still have 3 brilliant PhD students left. And I hope they can do really good research. Thank you.
I assume we can all take the course remotely now. So, our discussant, Chang-Tai Hsieh. Thank you very much. You want that?
All right. So, what I thought I would do, this is on Debbie's request, that I'm going to try to put these papers in a broader context. So there are 2 things I'm going to do. I'm going to first, I guess, try to explain what I think are some of the institutions behind the changes that these papers have talked about. And I want to also just speculate on what the broader consequences have been. So just to summarize, the 2 big changes that have taken place in China is the buildup of credit that largely takes a form of 2 new type of institutions, these local financing vehicles. And the other thing, which was just briefly talked about, but nobody really talked about in much detail, was basically the buildup of what's called the shadow banking system. And they're related but they're related, but they're not the same thing. Okay. The second thing, the second big change, and that's more recent, is the anti-corruption campaign that I didn't think was serious when it first started, but it looks like it's a much more serious thing than what I thought. So first, I just want to just give you some of just the broader macro facts. And then as I go through the story, I want you to just think about how these two forces could explain the macro facts that we see. So the first macro fact that everybody knows, which is the topic of the conference, is the buildup in debt. So everybody knows this. The second macro fact, and you can see this very clearly, is that there's been about a 10 percentage point increase in the investment rate. So China now has an investment rate of about 48 to 49% of GDP, which is the highest in the world. In 2007, 2008, it was about 40, 39, 44, 41. So there's been about a 8, 9, 10 percentage point increase in the investment rate. The other macro fact that is also obvious, but I don't see people have really talked about this, is that there's been a very large reversal of the current account surplus. So China used to run in the 2000s, they used to have a current account surplus of about 8, 9, 10% of the GDP. Now it's down to 2. It's down to 2. And this is important when you want to think about what are the consequences of these two big financial changes. And then the fourth thing, which has been widely discussed, is that there's been a sharp slowdown in growth. So growth used to be about 8-9% per year. Now it's down to roughly, my best guess is that it's about 5. That's my best guess. Okay, so I'll skip so first, the way I'll start, I think it's useful to just think about the institutional setup, okay? So it's clear that the key institution here is what local governments are doing. So I want to just spend a little bit of time just explaining what I think local governments are doing. And I think the way that I'm going to start this is I want to just show you some basic data. So the World Bank has been doing this project for roughly the last 15 years. So this was essentially Andrei Schleifer's baby. So basically what Andrei started is this project in which he goes around the world and he looks at the rules and the regulations affecting private businesses, and he quantifies it. So he does a bunch of things. You know, how many rules are there? How many taxes do you have to pay? How many offices in the government do you have to visit? If you want to get a license to start a business, what do you have to do if you want to get a power connection? What do you have to do if you want to register land? So just a lot of the basic processes that you need to go through if you want to run a private business. If you want to look at how China does in these measures in the world, so these are now, so basically this was started by Andrei, he handed it over to the World Bank, and the World Bank has been doing this for the last 15 years now. And it's really interesting data. And so the way, if you look at how China does, in terms of, say, I'll pick one, in terms of how easy it is to start a business in China, China ranks 151 out of 180 countries in the world. So just to know what what this is, so this is about the same as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, okay? So you may say that the Democratic Republic of Congo is fine, but the truth is that we're not holding conferences talking about the financial system of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Congo is where Angelina Jolie goes to, not where it's not the kind of place that so. And this is also not consistent with what you see with your eyes, right? Like, a place that ranks 150 in the world is where you send your foreign aid to. It's not the place that you are thinking about what is going on with the economy. And the way that I think you want to understand this puzzle is that you want to look at what is it that local governments are doing. So the way I thought I would illustrate this is by just giving you a story of what I think is going on in the ground. So this came from, so this was a visit that I made with some people that I was doing some work with to a small city in southern China. So this is a city of about 1.5 million people. It's an obscure city. So if I told them I wouldn't tell them, I wouldn't reveal the identifying information, but still, even if I told you the name of the city, you wouldn't know the city. So we went there because we knew somebody who was a vice mayor in charge of the education department in the city. And we went there, we spent a week there because we wanted to try to understand what is it that local governments were doing. So we got to the office of the vice mayor at around 10 o'clock in the morning, and we met up with his chief of staff, and the chief of staff told us that the vice mayor was really busy. He apologized. He was gonna try to meet with us that day, but he wasn't sure whether he was gonna be able to do it. So we ended up talking for most of the day with his chief of staff. And the chief of staff, after about 5 minutes, proudly handed us this flow chart where he said, this is what the vice mayor's office for education does. Okay, so again, it's a vice mayor's office, so they're in charge of evaluating the teachers, running the public schools, funding the schools. And here's our rough translation of the flow chart of, so what the vice mayor's office for education does. So here's my rough translation. They actively look for quality prospects. They have an active, they have a discussion to learn about the investor. They undertake a feasibility analysis. They identify land and other needed services. Whatever it is they're talking about goes for the approval of the vice mayor, and then sign the agreement. So it's very clear, very quickly, what is it that they're talking about? They're basically operating something like a private equity fund. Okay, that what the vice mayor and what this guy is doing is that they're not spending any of their time running the schools. What they're doing is that they're basically hunting for business, or they're hunting for business. And basically, it's what they do is that they hunt for business, and the deal that they offer to businesses is that they basically say that we're going to carve out all these special deals for you. All these rules that apply, that are on the books, they don't apply to you. They don't apply to you. And that's the way that you want to think about how the system works. So we spent the rest of the week just putting together data on just what businesses these were, what the quantity were. So just to get some sense of this particular local government, the number one guy was the party secretary. The number two guy was the mayor. You can clearly still don't ever go to the mayor first because the mayor is the number two guy, not the number one guy. You also see this in the license plate of their cars. The party secretary's license plate is 1, the mayor's is 2. It's 2, so don't. The only guy that has an exception was this guy that was mentioned, the guy who's in jail now, Bo Shilai. When he was the mayor, he was the number 2 guy. And he didn't like the fact that he was a number 2 guy. So he changed his license plate from being a 2 to a 5-1, which in Chinese sounds like I'm number 1. That's a story I've heard. I'm not sure whether it's true. And underneath the, what? That's a true story. Okay, so and underneath the mayor, there are 9 vice mayors. So it's organized like a typical cabinet. The guy that we knew was one of these guys. There was a vice mayor for population planning. That was the office responsible for implementing the one-child policy. There was the Department of Finance. But so we spent the rest of the week just going to these different offices, collecting data on what is it that they're doing, and getting data on their firms. And basically, they're all doing the same thing. That every one of these guys, they have basically they have a portfolio of companies. They have of private companies. So these are all. So just to make clear, these are not state-owned firms that they're dealing with. These are all privately owned firms. These are privately owned firms. So our rough count is that each one of these vice mayors had about 20 companies. It varies. Some had 15, some had 30. We didn't have access to the mayor or the party secretary, but it was clear that what everybody was saying is that the most important companies were directly handled by the party boss. So roughly the way that you want to think about this market is the way that you want to think about how the system works is that if you want to follow the rules, you follow the law, you follow the rules, you're good luck to you because you're in the Congo. But there's a system that everybody understands well, which is that you basically, the way that you want to do well is that you exploit this informal system. That is, it's not even an informal system, that everybody understands that this is the way that things work. And once you're in this informal system, then you get anything you want. You get anything. So all these rules, they don't apply to they don't apply to you. And it's useful to just think about how the system works when we start to talk about the buildup in debt, the buildup because it follows from this informal system. The other thing that's going to be important is that the way that the system has been operating for a long time is that it's been operating under very severe financial constraints, as a bunch of the authors mentioned. And this is a consequence of what was it that happened in the 1980s and the 1990s that nobody mentioned this, but there was a similar buildup in credit in China in the 1980s and the 1990s. The only difference was that the source of the financing came from foreign banks. It didn't come from domestic financial institutions. And basically, one of the key changes that was put in place from roughly 1998 to 2003 was that there were two big changes. There was a cleanup of the domestic financial financial system, and these hard constraints were put on these local governments such that to try to prevent a buildup in debt. To build up. But thinking about this, I think, helps you, I think, understand some of the things that you start to see in China. For example, there's been a lot of press about why is it that the ownership patterns of successful Chinese companies are so opaque. That is, if you look at any successful Chinese company, it's impossible to figure out who is actually the owner of the company. I think there's a reason why. There's a reason why it's impossible to know who the actual owners are. There's also a really interesting question about why is it that local governments behave this way? Because one of the things we also did is that we also did a time use survey of these guys. And these guys are working 24/7. Like the vice mayor that we knew, we went out for dinner with the chief of staff around 7 o'clock. The guy shows up at 11 o'clock at night. He apologized. He said that this was his fourth dinner that night. And what he was doing was he was going from the dinner to the dinner negotiating deals. I mean, so then he left at about 2 in the morning and he was back in his office at 7. He was back in his office at 7. So these guys are working, they're working 24/7. And the standard story in China that for this, and as has been mentioned by a bunch of authors, is that it's because your promotion depends on this. I guess I'm really skeptical of that story because when you look at a guy like this, like at this level, the probability that you get promoted from this level is basically zero. Because these guys are so low down the bureaucracy, yet everybody is doing this. And what I see really when I look at what these guys are doing is that they basically get private money from all this. And this is, I think, important in thinking about what happened after 2013, the anti-corruption campaign. So now move forward to what these papers are about. 2008. There's the world financial crisis. China's economy went into a downturn. The solution was to have a fiscal stimulus. Okay, so the plan was that they were to spend 4 trillion yen, which is about 12% of Chinese GDP, over 2 years, in 2009 and 2010. Okay, and basically, because most of the spending was done by local government, the decision was made that this had to be done by local governments. It made a lot of sense, but they were up against the budget rule that they had put in place to basically control what the local governments were doing for 20 years before the early 1980s. So then what do you do? How can you have a fiscal stimulus of 12% of GDP if you're not allowed to borrow? So there are two ways in which you could go about this, right? You could change the rules and say, okay, well, this is a national emergency and we're gonna change the rules because this is really important for the country. But that's not the way of doing things. The way of doing things is not to change the formal rules. The way to do things, it's, well, we can't change the formal rules, so let's carve out an exemption to the rule. Let's carve out an exemption to the rule so that we're not in violation of the rule, but we can still accomplish our objective. So that is the genesis of the buildup in debt. So the solution was to say, okay, we know that you can't borrow, but what we're going to do is that we're going to turn a blind eye, and not just that, we're going to encourage you to set up these off-balance sheet companies. We're going to encourage you to set up all these off-balance sheet companies, and you can borrow on behalf of the local government, and then with that money, you are going to meet these targets in terms of the fiscal stimulus. So the borrowing doesn't show up on your books. It doesn't show up on the books. So technically, you're not in violation of the law. Okay, so that's the genesis. But what I want to argue is that this particular way of doing things had long-run institutional consequences. Okay, that instead of doing it in a direct way, that this indirect way or this carving out and a special exemption to the rule had long-run consequences after the fiscal stimulus and after the fiscal stimulus ended. So this is something that Jennie mentioned. So if you look at the budget of the local government, basically you see none of the fiscal stimulus show up on the budget of the local government. So if you look at the additional spending by the local and the central government, it was about 1 trillion yen, roughly. And the plan was that they were to spend 4 trillion yen. So roughly about 1/4 showed up on the balance sheet, and about 3/4 was all off balance sheet spending. And then after the fiscal stimulus ended, okay, 2 things happened. The central government said, okay, guys, the fiscal stimulus is over. The fiscal stimulus is over. Then this thing about local financing vehicles, lending, no more. Okay? Now, if you're one of these guys and you say, wait, I've been starved of money for so long. You want me not to get rid of this tool that's being really useful for me? Forget about it. Right? Forget about it. Now, this might not be a problem if the guys at so there are basically 2 key central government institutions, which is the Ministry of Finance and the CBRC, CBRC. But the way that you want to understand the political system is that relative to the power of these local party officials, central government ministries have relatively little power. So another way to see this is to just go to Wikipedia and look at who are the members of the Chinese Politburo, and you're never going to find somebody that's a minister in the central government that is in the Chinese Politburo. What you are always going to find is that the party boss of Beijing is going to be there. The party boss of Shanghai is going to be there. The party boss of Guangzhou is almost always going to be there as well. So then when something happens and the CBRC tells the party boss of Beijing or Shanghai that I want you to do something, it's clear where the political powers lies. The minister is in terms of political rank, is the subordinate to the party bosses, to the party bosses. So then you can see, and it's sort of the way that the system works. The power is embedded, again, going back to the importance of these local government institutions. It also shows up in terms of the political structure of the party as well. So then what happened is that the central government basically tells the local government that you can't do this anymore, and it also tells the banks that they can't lend to these local financing vehicles anymore. What you see in the data then is that the commercial banks do stop their lending because the banks are the subordinates. But then what happened was that this led to the rise of this new financial institution, which are the shadow banks. So it was after this crackdown, crackdown, which is again another exemption to the rule. It's about carving another. So these wealth management products, all these things. And now these things account for about, in terms of flow, about 10% of 10% of GDP. There was a further crackdown, and I'll show you that it basically didn't work. What happened was that these local financing institutions grew and grew and grew. Not that, and it's not just that they grew, but they also dramatically changed what they did. And I'll show you that data next. What's also, there's been a lot of discussion in the media about how in 2014 and 15, there was a more serious crackdown in terms of borrowing by these local governments. There was this push to try to move their debt from off the books to on the books. It did have an effect on changing the composition of what of these local financing vehicles did. But can I have one more minute, Jonathan? But I'll show you in a minute that it dramatically changed what they did. So let me just quickly talk about just the magnitude of this, because I think it's important that there are basically two sources of data on this. There's the data set from this company called Win. Think of this as the Bloomberg of China, okay? And this data, it basically comes from the financial statements of these local financing vehicles that issue bonds, okay? There's another data, which comes from an audit of all the local financing vehicles, but it's important to remember that the audit data only covers what they call official debt, which is debt that the government has a responsibility to repay, or debt the government will fulfill the responsibility for paying. But here's the way to think about what these local financing vehicles look like now. So I'll give you an example of one of them. So this is a company that I know, which is the Beijing local financing vehicles that was responsible for building the sports facilities, okay? If you look at so the company is called BSAM, the Beijing Asset Management Company. They had, in 2015, they had a total debt of about 70 billion yen. That's about $11–12 billion. But if you look at the portfolio of what they do, they started out to finance, they were created as finance of the sports facilities, but that's now only just a tiny fraction of what they do. They also own the Bank of Beijing. They own the Beijing Auto Group. So if you've been to Beijing and you wonder why all the taxis are Hyundais, this is the reason why. That the Hyundais are made by the Beijing Auto Group. So just 30 more seconds, Jonathan. No. So just to give you the number, these are the total number of local financing vehicles from the two sources of data. This is from the Win data that Jennie used, which is basically all the financing vehicles that issue bonds. The two dots is essentially the data from the official audits that were conducted by the government. So basically the Win data, the bond issuing companies, there are about 1,700 of them. The total number of these financing vehicles, it's about 7,000. Okay? So the bond issuing, the publicly available data, it's just a fraction of so what you can do then is that you can estimate the amount of debt in these local financing vehicles that is missing. That is missing. So here's our attempt to do this. If you look at the official data, the total debt is about 23 trillion yen. If you estimate, so basically, I'll spare you the details of how we estimate it. If you include the debt by all the local financing vehicles, our best estimate is about 45 trillion yen. And most of that is not spent on infrastructure projects. Most of it is basically spent on things like banks, on banks, on car companies. Another big thing that these things do is that they finance startups. So maybe the best way to think about what these companies are is that think about Berkshire Hathaway. They're like the Berkshire Hathaway in terms of what is it that they're doing. And there are about 8,000 of them. There are about 8,000 of them, with the only distinction of, it's not clear what their underlying budget constraint is. Okay? All right, I'll stop here and I can talk about the broader.
We have a slight temporal debt now. But let's go ahead and I'll collect questions for the authors or the discussant, please. Just raise a hand. Yes, go ahead.
Second director, can you provide advice to the United States, like in Connecticut, you have developed the kind of Connecticut and New York, there are officials who are trying to invest in the states to promote growth in companies. From what you found in China, can we get any advice? Or perhaps not. The other thinking is that, well, perhaps there's so much corruption there. Why they're so effective is that if the government officials at the CDB make bad investments, maybe they're going to lose more than their job. Or if the companies don't pay them back, maybe it'll be more than just hurting their credit rating. You know, I watch too much TV, obviously. So is there corruption having to do a play about why they're getting such good returns? Or conversely, it's really similar to the US, and maybe you could provide advice to our development officers in our states.
Yeah, so first of all, that's a very good question. So the reason why CDB can enjoy the better performance is because they have a good relationship with the local government. And usually they will ask the local government to sign the guarantee for these loans. So that's probably the major reason why the local government want to pay back the CDB first. So, but I'm not sure in the other countries you can do such thing to arrange such agreement with the government. Yeah.
And it sounds like the politicians have an equity upside,
Yeah.
which is incentives, right? That's not in the United States. Yes. And did you-
Hi, first of all, thank you for all of you for tremendous presentations, which really get a lot of detail on what many of us who aren't experts in China just see it or remove. But let's go back to the big picture that we see it or remove, the 30,000 mile or foot high perspective. The aggregate debt load in China, by historical standards of any other economy, is unsustainable. And from what you're saying, it's all on the local governments. Now, the national government obviously has very strong financial status, at least from what's reported. So can the local governments indefinitely sustain this debt load? Or can their own economics, maybe their taxing or other revenue-raising authorities support the debt load? Or does the national government bail out the local governments? Or some other way of making this load, converting it into equity, for example? How does this, by historical standards, unsustainable debt load get managed?
Okay, so let me first answer this by historical standard. It's not necessarily unsustainable. You know, think of UK out of the Second World War. You know, it's a 400% of debt. You can grow out of it. So that's one way to do it, growth. The other way is inflation out of it. So current economy in China is actually overheating. So the government is actually trying to tone down the growth to prevent overeating. The third way is to do, this is domestic debt. You know, it's not foreign obligations, so there's no balance of payment crisis. So I think all three ways works. If really as scary as you said, then China economy would have bankrupt in 1980 once, 1990 twice, 2000 third time, and now fourth time. But it's not. So the GDP is maybe 8 times higher than 30 years ago. And Russia, did what we said is zero, no growth at all, maybe.
So can I add a house comment? So basically, currently in China, we have this program called the debt swap. So basically, they want to switch from, for the local government debt, they want to switch from the bank loans to the public bond issuance. And so the difference is that usually the maturity of these bank loans are 3 to 5 years. For CDB, it could be longer. But for this bond issuance, it could be 10 years or more than 10 years. So they kind of delay all this loan payment by this debt swap program. So like Hao said, maybe the Chinese economy will grow, hopefully will grow more in the future, and we could resolve this problem. Yeah.
Could I just press the point on investment as a share of GDP? You might find episodes in history of debt to GDP. I think navigating their way out of it was a little tougher for the UK at various points in history. But are there any other parallels in history you're aware of a 50% investment share?
Stalin, we had. Singapore also got.
There are two countries that in Korea in the run-up to 1998 and Singapore. Those are the only two places that have had an investment rate that's that high. Not even Japan during its period of rapid growth. I just want to say something in response to the last question. I think that's, with all apology, I think that's a wrong way of thinking about the question. That it's not about the capacity of the local government. If you look at what the projects are, that the way that most of the money is now, for roughly the last 5 years now, roughly 90% of the money has been going to what I'm going to call private companies. It's going to commercial projects. It's not going, the money has not been, most of the money has not been going to ghost cities or infrastructure. That is there, of course, and that's been the focus of, that's been a lot of the focus, but most of the money is going to private companies. The other thing that you want to think about is that basically where the money, in terms of, you want to think about the overall portfolio of the Chinese financial system, I didn't get to talk about this, that nothing has happened to national savings. The savings rate has not changed. The way that you want to think about it is that China used to save 10% of its GDP in the form of US Treasury bonds. And then what's happened is that it's basically swapped its investment in US Treasury bonds towards the investment of what these local financing vehicles have been doing. So the question is basically, is having 10% of your GDP every year going towards the Bank of Beijing, going to these car companies, is that better than putting 10% of GDP in Treasury bills? And I don't know the answer to that question. So
let me add that. Actually, Chang-Tai is right that Korea maybe is the only country, maybe 50% growth, investments to GDP. And Korea is also one of the only 2 or 5 countries, rising from low income per capita country to a high income per capita country. So that's probably needed.
Singapore, the same.
Singapore, I think. No other country lower growth investment ratio has ever break medium income trend. No other.
Ben, and then up front.
With respect to the paper on the anti-corruption, the finding was that the program had been good for the real, advancing the real economy. My question is, if the data came out and had a different conclusion, let's say that it was bad for the economy, would there have been problems publishing that paper?
Well, that's a great question. In fact, the published paper mostly found the other way around. It's easy to publish if you find that actually anti-corruption campaign in China is doing bad things to the economy. So if you're saying the other way around, I think it's against, you will read the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and most of my academic colleagues, Laura Liu's paper, Lin Zhen's paper, basically that's easy to publish. So when these 2 assistant professors want to take on the project, I actually discourage them. I said, I don't care publication, but you do. So in the end, I think this is a counterintuitive finding on the surface, but I think it's the most important issue we want to look at it. I would think it's one of the most important paper, or maybe the most important paper I ever written, but I'm not counting the publication. I'm counting its impact in the policy circle and telling the right story. I think that's the thing I'm counting on. Of course, I would feel for my co-authors, their assistant professors, eventually publish in the top journal to help their career. But this is the most important thing I think we should study.
Okay, up front here.
So I had a kind of a narrow question for Jennie, but I think it speaks to some of the larger questions here. So I was sort of interested in this counterintuitive result you had related to bond liquidity, and So that made me wonder, who are the investors in these bonds? And, does that somehow matter? And as we think about all this debt, it's sort of like who's holding all of these liabilities?
So investors on the Cheng-Tai bond, as one slide mentioned, 80% of them is shadow banking. Chang-Tai has paper on the shadow banking. A lot of them, pretty much a lot of the fixed income fund, they all chasing that Cheng-Tai bond because they perceive this implicit guarantee and they want to reaching for yield. Those yield is really distant. That's why the liquidity play opposite role in here. But most of them institutional investors. And if you're looking at some of the best performing fixed income fund in China, they are the big buyers on the Cheng-Tai bond.
So what was your liquidity measures? Volume traded?
We tried multiple measures using the traditional academic literature like the Army Hood liquidity measure, the bid-ask spread. We also tried the turnover ratio and the total trading volume, all of them.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So first of all, thank you, all of you, very much for a fascinating story. So I wanted to get back to the sustainability, whether this level of debt is sustainable. So in terms of the revenue streams for the local governments, we talked about how the sale of the lands, there's a lot of talk about, now most of the lands are already sold. Where are you going to get the revenue? Where are you going to get the recurring revenues. So I've been heard about real estate taxes, and I wonder where that stands now. And I'm also wondering if the revenue allocation between the local governments and the central governments, maybe if there are any talks about reallocating that a little bit. Thank you.
Let me answer first, and then Jennie add. So there is efforts for the local government to compile their balance sheet. So you only look at the debt, you haven't looked at their assets. In fact, there's a preliminary study that assets is more than, far more, in terms of quantity than their debt. So this is one issue already. The other issue about the debt sustainability, the 250% of debt, the household debt is high quality, mostly paid off mortgage. Also the central government is under-leveraged. The only two components is problematic. It's SOE debt and the local government debt. However, they are legacy problems. They are not sectors you can apply market solution. They are historically accumulated by the central and the local government for stability purpose. So the only way to do that is not default those debt, but restructuring, like they did in the late 1990s about the SOEs and the 2000s on the, those four large banks. They are 30% non-performing loan at that time. So this time, it's not that bad, actually much better than that. But they are political issues. They are not simple economic default issue. They are political issue, has to be addressed by reforms the SOE and the local government, by building the balance sheet, and changing the ownership structure of the SOE. So it's a great question, but the most of the debt burden part, there's no market solution. There's only an institutional reform solution to that.
So putting it all together, the local governments, it sounds like, have substantial, real economy assets, right? So another way of saying that is there's a lot of hidden state-owned enterprises in China. The local governments have an equity stake, right? But the equity stake doesn't really show on the organization chart. So I'm trying to put this together with the anti-corruption campaign, because the reason it works is that the vice mayors and the party secretary must be personally getting the income from these stakes, right? Or otherwise the incentives would not be aligned. But if there's really going to be an anti-corruption campaign, then these companies would turn into kind of traditional state-owned enterprises. So, as with so many things in China, to an ignorant outsider, it does not look like a very stable system. I mean, how do you get to a more stable ownership and control structure for these hidden state-owned enterprises?
So I think that is the central question. I mean, I think the central question is really not about the debt. I think that really is a sideshow. That really the central question is I mean, to the extent that, in my view, the debt matters only to the extent that they interact with what local governments have been doing. So let's put aside the issue of the anti-corruption campaign. So you can think about that if it's just the one model is that these local governments have high-powered incentives, but they are financially constrained. So the private gains is essentially a way. I come from Chicago, so you could think of that as being like the coast solution to bad institutions. That as long as you can bargain, then as long as you remove all the barriers to bargaining, then you can reach an efficient efficient allocation. And then the only quibbles are about the distribution of the gains. And then in that argument, they're basically relaxing these financial constraints basically moves China forward. You could tell a different story that what happens is that once you relax these financial constraints, what you start to see is more misallocation of capital between like basically the firms that are favored by the private firms that are favored by the local governments. They get preferential access to capital. Other firms that don't get preferential access to capital. The evidence that I've seen is that it's more of the second story, but then I'm still agnostic about whether even those losses are greater than the losses from putting all your money into treasury bills. Because that's the other alternative that you wanted to think about. That the system used to put 10% of GDP in the form of treasury bills, which sounds like a really inefficient thing to be doing. Now, the anti-corruption campaign, I mean, my sense is that really is the main thing. That really is the main thing. So the city that I showed you the slides of, I went back last summer, and these guys are now terrified beyond belief, and so they're not doing anything. They're not doing anything. So then. So it's not that they're doing anything. What you see is that the very big guys, they're still getting their deals. They're still getting their, because that you can justify politically. You can still, so if a company like Foxconn comes, you can still justify that politically. It's what happens to the medium-sized companies that they used to have easy access to, I'm going to call it good institutions, that they're now finding it a lot more difficult. And it's hard to prove, but my sense is that really is the main thing behind the slowdown of growth. And I think that is the major tension going forward in terms of, there was a special, maybe unsustainable system that made the system work, and the question is, what is going to replace that system? I don't think we know.
If anti-corruption campaign is a way to investigate when things don't go well, that's just more high-powered incentives to make sure they do. So selectively, right, if when the tide goes out, you find corruption, then people have the upside that's the equity and the downside that's jail. That's even more high-powered incentives. There's just the upside that's equity. So the question is really, how is it designed and how does it go forward? Are we trying to move to a slightly different system, or is it just a more high-powered incentive system? Any last questions? I think we have just 1 or 2 minutes left.
I have a follow-up.
Okay, we'll fill in with the follow-up and then go to lunch. Go ahead.
Okay. So So the local governments have a lot of assets, right? But it doesn't, do they really have a lot of assets, right?
I mean,
Because the
yeah.
debt is these local government financing
Is the debt
vehicles, right?
backing good stuff?
Well, no. I mean, you know, if I came to the vice mayor, right, say I want to do this firm, right, the firm is going to have an ownership structure, and it's not obvious to me that the local government has an equity stake, right, in that. And it's not obvious to me that the local government really has control over that firm if suddenly it needs money to repay its debt. So I understand that there's, in the real sense we were talking about a moment ago, assets, right, that the local government has created. But it's not obvious to me that in a situation where cash flows from those assets have to go to repay the debt, that the ownership and control structure is going to cause that to happen.
So let me answer that by clarifying what Jennie didn't say in her presentation, that Chinese political and economic system is a unitary system, not a federal system. So the county government is guaranteed by city government. City government by the provincial government. Provincial government guaranteed by the central government. So if you're counting all the assets, current high-speed rail, all those things, it's covered the debt. The only thing is the mechanism. Do you want to just pay out everybody, or you want to make it accountable? That's why things going slow. If you just want to abolish the debt, it's doable instantly, but they cannot do it. They don't want to do it. They want to do it in an accountable way. That's why it's slow and difficult.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll adjourn for lunch.